On the morning of April 6, 1933, something unprecedented happened. Millions of Americans opened their eyes, stretched after another uneasy night of the Great Depression, and discovered that they were now lawbreakers. Not because they had robbed a bank. Not because they had committed fraud. But because they owned gold. Just yesterday, having a few gold coins tucked away in a drawer was a symbol of security, something a grandfather might pass down to his grandson with the words, "This will protect you one day." But overnight, that symbol of safety became evidence of a federal crime. With a single signature, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt transformed an ordinary homeowner with a handful of gold eagles into a potential felon facing up to 10 years in prison and a crushing fine equivalent to multiple years of income. It didn't matter if the gold had been in the family for generations. It didn't matter if it represented the last savings people clung to as banks collapsed all around them. The message was clear. America's gold now belonged to the government. And the people had 25 days to hand it over. This moment marked the beginning of what many historians later called one of the most controversial and morally ambiguous acts in U.S. financial history, an act disguised as economic salvation, but experienced by millions as a forced surrender. Why did the government suddenly treat its own citizens like criminals? Why did ordinary people line up at banks with bags full of family savings and heirlooms? And how did the government profit massively from gold it claimed to be saving for the nation? To understand this, we must go back to a country broken, frightened, and willing to believe that giving up their last symbol of security was the only way to survive. To understand why millions complied so quickly, we need to step back into the America of 1933, a country that looked nothing like the world we know today. The Great Depression hadn't just bruised the nation. It had shattered it. Banks were collapsing every single day. Factories stood silent, their chimneys cold. Entire cities were filled with men wandering the streets, searching for work that no longer existed. Families lost their homes, farms disappeared overnight, and the horrifying reality set in. Even food wasn't guaranteed anymore. Fear wasn't just in society, it was society. And in the middle of this chaos, one thing still carried a sense of certainty. A glimmer. A color that promised safety when everything else crumbled. Gold. Gold coins. Gold bars. Gold certificates folded in old wallets. To Americans of that era, gold wasn't an investment, it was survival. Paper dollars? People no longer trusted them. Too many banks had taken deposits and evaporated into bankruptcy. Too many families had watched a lifetime of savings turn into worthless pieces of paper. But gold was real. Heavy. Tangible. Eternal. It had value when governments rose and fell, when currencies inflated, when the world spun out of control. For many families, gold coins were the only safety net they had left. The emergency fund for hard winters, medical crises, and uncertain futures. Yet while the public clung to gold as their lifeline, the new president saw something entirely different. Franklin Delano Roosevelt looked at private gold ownership not as security, but as an obstacle, a barrier between him and the bold economic rescue plan he had envisioned. To him, every ounce held in private hands weakened the government's ability to rebuild the nation. And so, a dramatic idea began to form in the corridors of power. A plan that would require taking from the people the very thing they trusted most. But before the plan could be executed, the government needed a justification, a financial explanation grounded in the very foundations of the American money system. Because to seize gold from an entire nation, you must first show why you need it. To understand why Roosevelt believed he had to take gold from the people, we need to revisit the foundation of America's financial system, a foundation built entirely on shiny yellow metal. For more than half a century since 1879, the United States lived under the gold standard. This meant something revolutionary in today's world. Every single dollar in circulation was legally required to be backed by a specific amount of gold stored in government vaults. The government couldn't just print money whenever it wanted. Every banknote needed a golden twin sitting somewhere in the treasury. It was a system many Americans trusted deeply. It meant their money wasn't just paper, it was a claim to real, physical value. As long as the gold standard existed, a dollar was a dollar. No tricks. No arbitrary decisions. But in 1929, everything changed. When the stock market crashed, it didn't just take down Wall Street. It pulled the entire financial system into a black hole. Across the country, banks began to fail one after another. Some collapsed overnight, leaving families stunned as their life savings disappeared behind locked doors and foreclosure signs. Panicked Americans flooded banks demanding to withdraw their deposits, not in bills but in gold. The real stuff, coins they could hold, metal they could trust. But there was a problem. The government didn't have enough gold to satisfy everyone. By early 1933, the Federal Reserve's reserves were draining at an alarming rate. Every day, tons of gold walked out of bank vaults in the pockets and briefcases of terrified citizens. If this continued just a little longer, the gold standard, and with it the entire American economy, would collapse. Roosevelt realized something. He couldn't save America without first breaking the financial rulebook. To rescue the dollar, he needed to sever its link to gold. To sever the link, he needed full control of the nation's gold. And to gain control, he needed to take it from the hands of millions of Americans. It was a plan so massive, so unprecedented, that it bordered on the impossible. But Roosevelt was about to make the impossible happen. With a stroke of a pen. April 5, 1933. Franklin Roosevelt had been in the Oval Office for barely a month. The nation was drowning in panic. Banks were collapsing faster than the government could count them. Americans were hoarding gold like their lives depended on it. And then, the president signed one of the most controversial documents in American history. Executive Order 6102. A dry bureaucratic title. Forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates. But behind those calm words hid something shocking. Every American, without exception, was required to hand over their gold to the government within 25 days. All coins. All bars. All gold certificates. Family treasures, heirloom coins, life savings collected over generations. It all had to go. There were only a few tiny exemptions. Jewelry, rare collector coins, dental gold, and small industrial amounts. Everything else was now contraband. And the government wasn't asking. It was demanding. The exchange rate was fixed at $20.67 per ounce. No negotiation, no argument, no consideration of market value. We're buying your gold at this price and you have no choice. Refuse? You faced a fine of $10,000, about 6 years of an average salary, or 10 years in prison. Or both. Penalties harsher than some violent crimes. But threats alone weren't enough. The government needed the people to believe surrendering gold was their patriotic duty. And so began one of the most intense propaganda campaigns in U.S. history. Newspapers warned that keeping gold harmed the economy and slowed recovery. Radio hosts preached that surrendering gold would create jobs and revive the nation. Banks hung giant posters. Turn in your gold, save America. Your patriotic duty is to help your country. Anyone who hesitated was painted as selfish, unpatriotic, even dangerous. A hoarder sabotaging the future of the nation. The pressure worked. People felt trapped between fear of punishment and fear of being labeled traitors. And so, within days, a stunned nation that had once trusted gold more than the government began lining up at banks, holding bags of coins and bars they never thought they'd be forced to give away. The largest transfer of private wealth into government hands in American history had begun. By May 1st, the deadline day, the transformation of America was unfolding in full view. Across the country, lines stretched out of bank doors and wrapped around entire blocks. Men in worn coats held small cloth bags filled with the last gold coins their families owned. Elderly women clutched metal tins containing savings passed down from parents and grandparents, coins from the gold rush era, double eagles minted in the days when owning gold meant hope for a better life. People weren't carrying wealth. They were carrying memories. Some held coins their great-grandfather had dug from cold California rivers in 1850. Others brought gold bars bought decades earlier as insurance for old age. And now these pieces of family history were being slid across counters in silence, exchanged for paper bills everyone knew were losing value by the day. The government's expectations were high, but the results went far beyond anything they imagined. Within a single month, Americans surrendered nearly 3 million ounces of personal gold, roughly $118 million at the time. Adjusted for modern purchasing power, that's around $10 billion. But this was only the beginning. Once private citizens turned over their gold, corporations, banks, and institutions followed. In total, the U.S. government seized around 3,673 tons of gold, enough to overshadow the reserves of entire modern nations. To put that into perspective, that's more gold than China officially holds today. Nearly double Russia's reserves. If stacked into standard bars, the tower would rise higher than Mount Everest. At today's prices, it would be worth around $395 billion. This wasn't just a policy. It was a transfer of wealth on a scale the world had never witnessed, carried out not by thieves, but by citizens who believed they were doing the right thing. They had no idea what the government was about to do next. Because the most cynical twist of this story was still ahead. A twist that would reveal just how deeply Americans had been misled. Americans had done their part. They stood in lines, surrendered their savings, handed over gold that had been in their families for generations. They trusted the government's promise that this sacrifice was necessary, that it was for the good of the nation. But less than a year later, that trust would be shattered. January 30, 1934. Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, and President Roosevelt signed it into law. With a single decision, overnight, the official price of gold jumped from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. A nearly 70% increase. Let's put that into simple math. The government forced citizens to sell gold at $20.67 per ounce. Then the government revalued that same gold at $35 per ounce. And instantly pocketed the profit, billions of dollars in today's terms. On the gold confiscated from its own people, the U.S. government made about $2.8 billion in 1930s money. For perspective, the entire federal budget in 1934 was around $6 billion. This means nearly half of America's government spending that year was financed through a profit extracted from citizens who were told they had no choice. While ordinary Americans held paper dollars losing their purchasing power, their former gold was bringing the government unprecedented gains. Not everyone accepted this quietly. One man, Frederick Barber Campbell, a businessman from San Francisco, tried to fight back. He owned more than $200,000 worth of gold bars, a fortune at that time, and refused to surrender them. He hired top lawyers. He argued that the confiscation violated the Fifth Amendment, the right to private property and fair compensation. His case reached the Supreme Court. But in 1935, the court delivered its verdict. In the infamous Norman v. Baltimore and Ohio Railroad decision, the justices ruled that Congress had the right to regulate the value of money, and that gold clauses in contracts were invalid. In other words, the Supreme Court legalized the entire operation. It confirmed that the government could change the value of money at will, and seize assets it deemed necessary to support that change. Campbell lost. He collapsed from a heart attack during one of the hearings, crushed not only by the case, but by the realization that the system offered no protection. His defeat wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. A message to the entire country. Resistance is useless. Thousands who tried to hide gold were tracked down. Banks reported suspicious activity. The FBI investigated aggressively. In just the first 3 years, thousands of criminal cases were opened, many ending in heavy fines or prison terms. And the government, now in possession of mountains of confiscated gold, needed a place to store it. A fortress worthy of the scale of the operation. With thousands of tons of gold flowing into government hands, the United States faced a new problem. Where do you store the greatest accumulation of wealth in the country's history? The answer rose from the fields of Kentucky. A building so fortified, so impenetrable, it would become a legend. Fort Knox. Construction began in 1936. The cost, $560,000, a huge sum at the time. But no expense was spared. Walls thicker than a man's arm span, made of reinforced concrete. A vault door weighing 20 tons. A locking system so complex that no single person knows the entire combination. The code is split among multiple officials. Armed guards, fenced perimeters, restricted airspace. Security systems decades ahead of their time. By 1941, Fort Knox held over 650 million ounces of gold, more than half of all U.S. reserves. Gold that, just a few years earlier, belonged to ordinary American families. But did all of this, the confiscation, the propaganda, the legal battles, the forced surrender, actually save the U.S. economy? Even today, economists argue. Many insist Roosevelt's drastic policy accelerated recovery from the Great Depression, injecting liquidity and confidence at a moment when failure seemed inevitable. But the moral cost was undeniable. A government that promised stability had instead broken its own financial contract with its people. It asked for trust, then used that trust to force a sacrifice the nation never forgot. And to this day the controversy continues. Officially, the United States claims to possess 8,133 tons of gold. Unofficially, nobody really knows. The last public audit of Fort Knox was in 1974. Since then, the vault's contents have been shrouded in secrecy, speculation, and suspicion. Did the government that once misled its people about gold stop there? Or is there more to uncover? That is a story for another time. If you want more stories like this, stories about lost fortunes, secret financial decisions, and the hidden history behind our money, subscribe to Finance Archives. We dig through the past so you can understand the truth behind the world today.